I guess you could ask me what my opinion is now. Based on what I've heard, yeah, it sounds like NATO is not something that leftists should support. So I have a confession to make. I am a bad leftist. One of the main requirements to being an online leftist these days is hating NATO. I don't really know the history of NATO. I mean, I know what it is from a 10,000 mile high view, but why leftists have a seething hate for it, I don't really understand. Because I just don't really know much about it. So I have 2 videos to hopefully educate myself. Some on the left hate NATO, here's why, and what is NATO, why does it still exist, and how does it work? The reason I'm talking about this is because with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, other countries are looking to join NATO, notably Finland, who joined about a week ago, and Sweden, who are going to be joining soon as well. Okay, so let's see what this is all about. Wait, I have an idea. Why do leftists hate NATO? Not all leftists hate NATO, but some do have strong criticisms of the organization. It is important to note that the term leftist encompasses a broad range of political ideologies, and individuals within this category may have varying opinions on NATO. Not from my experience being on like Twitter and like Reddit and stuff. Like, well, Reddit seems to be pretty pro-NATO, but they're pretty more liberal than leftist. However, some common concerns among leftists who criticize NATO include opposition to militarism and intervention. Okay, I can, sympathize with that. Some leftists are anti-war or anti-militarist. Yeah, I'd call myself that. In their political views, believing that the presence of NATO can encourage military aggression and intervention in other countries. They argue that this can lead to destabilization, suffering, and loss of life. Okay, I can definitely empathize with that one. Perceived imperialism. Oh, okay, that's probably a big one. Some leftists view NATO as a tool of Western imperialism. Okay, that tracks. That adds up. This is probably the main reason from, like I said, an online leftist perspective, which historically has been used to impose its economic, political, and cultural influence on other nations. They argue that NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, for example, has only served to extend this domination. Resource allocation. Leftists may argue that the financial resources devoted to NATO could be better spent on social programs such as healthcare, education, and poverty alleviation. Yeah, okay. Totally on board. Let's keep going, though. Yeah, totally agree with that one. Concerns about nuclear weapons. NATO's reliance on a nuclear deterrent through the nuclear sharing arrangements with the United States is another point of concern for some leftists. Yeah, I'm definitely concerned about nukes for sure. They argue that the use or even the threat of nuclear weapons is inherently immoral and possesses an existential risk to humanity. Okay, I agree with that. Perceived undermining of national sovereignty. Some leftists argue that NATO's influence can undermine the sovereignty of member nations, as it may pressure them into making decisions that are not in their best interest or reflective of their citizens' desires. Okay. It's important to know that blah, 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 blah. Okay. Like I said, I think it's probably this one above, probably 2, 1, 3, 4, 5 in terms of how it would rank leftist, priorities here. I don't know. Okay, whatever. Let's just watch these videos. Starting with, what is NATO, why does it still exist, and how does it work? 2020, but hopefully this stuff will still be relevant. Let's take a look.
The North Atlantic Alliance was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War. Its purpose was to secure peace in Europe, to promote cooperation among its members, and to guard their freedom.
Those things sound good right off the bat. Obviously, you can't build a house on good intentions, but, cooperation between countries is something I support quite a bit, much more than isolationism, you know what I mean?
All of this in the context of countering the threat posed at the time by the Soviet Union.
Oh, okay. That's probably another big reason why leftists hate NATO, is because its initial creation was to be a force to unite the West, so to speak, against the Soviet Union, who, leftists tend to be, supportive of to varying degrees, let's say. But okay, the picture's starting to come totally clear. But let's see.
The alliance's founding treaty was signed in Washington in 1949
Washington's over here. It's where I live. What's this?
by a dozen European and North American countries. It commits the Allies to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, as well as to peaceful resolution of disputes. Importantly, the treaty sets out the idea of collective defense, meaning that an attack against one ally is considered as an attack against all allies. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, ensures that the security of its European member countries is inseparably linked to that of its North American member countries. The organization also provides a unique forum for dialogue and cooperation across the Atlantic. The alliance started with 12 member countries in 1949. However, the founding...
By the way, I just realized, I just realized this is actually from NATO, so it's going to be incredibly sanitized and biased. Don't worry, leftist. We got what I think is going to be the more, leftist perspective. I don't know what this channel is. Maybe this will be more right-leaning and shitting on the left. I really don't know. But I didn't realize that this was straight from the horse's mouth. So let's keep that in mind.
Treaty allows for other European nations to join the alliance as long as all existing allies agree. Any prospective member must share NATO's core values and have the capacity and willingness to contribute to security in the Euro-Atlantic area. Today, NATO has 30 members who are stronger and safer together. For 7 decades, NATO has ensured peace within its territory. While threats and the way NATO deals with them have evolved over time, the purpose, values, and founding principles of the alliance do not change. For its first 4 decades, the Cold War defined the alliance. Collective defense was NATO's main role. When that confrontation ended in 1989, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, some said that NATO had fulfilled its purpose, that it was no longer needed. And yet the alliance is still here today. So why has NATO stood the test of time? The end of the Cold War offered hope for progress and peace, but it also ushered in a new era of instability. NATO has responded to changes in the security environment by shifting its focus and taking on new tasks. Beyond ensuring the collective defense of its members, NATO seeks to promote security through partnership and cooperation. Since the early 1990s, the alliance has developed relations with non-member countries, including former Cold War adversaries of the former Eastern Bloc. Some of these partners have since become members of the alliance. Today, working with non-member countries and other organizations is considered to be one of NATO's fundamental tasks. It works with 40 partner countries, as well as with other international organizations, like the United Nations and the European Union. NATO has taken on an important role in international crisis management since the end of the Cold War. Working closely with partner countries, the alliance helped to end war and build sustainable peace in the Balkans. In the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States, allies and partners deployed forces to Afghanistan to help bring stability. During the Arab Spring, NATO led an air campaign over Libya to protect civilians being targeted by the Gaddafi dictatorship.
Some of this stuff, I wish I had a way to fact check.
NATO and its partners have helped to prevent piracy off the Horn
Fact
of
check
Africa
me in the comment. Fact check this in the comments.
to fight terrorism in the Mediterranean Sea. NATO has also supported international efforts to stem illegal migration and human trafficking in the Aegean Sea. Today, we face a much broader range of threats than in the past. To the east, Russia has become more assertive with the illegal annexation of Crimea and destabilization of
Just you wait, NATO. Just you wait for what's coming 2 years from now.
Eastern Ukraine, as well as its military buildup close to NATO's borders. To the south, the security situation in the Middle East and Africa has deteriorated, causing loss of life, fueling large-scale migration flows, and inspiring terrorist attacks. NATO is responding by reinforcing its deterrence and defense posture. as well as supporting international efforts to project stability and strengthen security outside NATO territory. We are also confronted with the spread of weapons of mass destruction, cyber attacks, and threats to energy supplies, as well as environmental challenges with security implications. These challenges are too big for any one country or organization to handle on its own. So NATO is working closely with its network of partners to help tackle them. While NATO continues to adapt to changes in the security environment, the fundamentals of how it works haven't changed. Consensus and consultation are part of NATO's DNA. All member countries are represented in the North Atlantic Council, where decisions are taken by consensus, meaning unanimously, expressing the collective will of all the nations. There is no NATO army. National forces are under national command. When called upon, allied nations volunteer their troops, equipment, or other capabilities to NATO-led operations and exercises. Each member state pays for its own armed forces and covers the costs of deploying its forces. But together, the allies get a lot more security for a lot less cost than they would if they had to do it alone. Each member contributes a small percentage of its national defense budget to NATO. The national contributions pay for running the political and operational headquarters in Belgium, as well as the integrated military command structure across NATO territory. They also cover some of the costs of shared military capabilities, systems and facilities needed for communication, command and control, or for logistical support to NATO operations. Other multinational capability projects are funded by groups of allies. Thanks to years of joint planning, exercises and deployments, soldiers from different nations can work well together when the need arises. Working together, the allies are stronger.
Okay, I mean, that was obviously a very sanitized view of what this organization is. I'm sure peppered in with lots of bias, maybe misconstrued truths. So let's take a look at another perspective. This is my first time learning about what NATO truly is, and in my eyes is the closest thing we have to a world government. I mean, the UN? The closest thing we have to no borders and being one planet. I mean, that's something I would like someday as well. We may be a few hundred years away from that reality, maybe even thousands, but after learning what NATO is, I think I could support its existence. I'm not 100% sure what they have done and why some people don't like them, but I like the idea behind it. Okay, this is kind of where I'm at right now. Like, I'm curious to know what, again, we'll get to this video, but like what exactly they've done that like the left hates so much. I'm sure they've committed plenty of war crimes and things like that, on top of just like the broad, imperialism argument. But the idea behind it, again, I'm all for more cooperation. I think more cooperation is, correct me if I'm wrong, almost always better than less cooperation. So let's move on. Some on the left hate NATO. Here's why, from TLDR News, who I don't know who that is, but let's take a look.
This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The first 200 people to use the link below get 20% off an annual subscription. While generally speaking, members of NATO are in favour of their membership.
Bro, what? Is this like 1p? You gotta focus your camera, dude.
There appears to be a growing resentment towards NATO among certain communities online. One such potentially unlikely opponent of NATO is the far left.
Unlikely? Why would that be unlikely?
How come, though? Aren't the left meant to be in favour of global cooperation and organisations that foster peace?
That's kind of where I'm at. Like, I'm for more cooperation among countries around the world. So, he's bringing up a good point, I guess.
Well, let's have a look into this. To fully understand this, we need to first understand why NATO was created and what it's for. The roots of NATO are in the Second World War. The pact was initiated between France and the UK, and this took effect on the 4th of March 1947 following the signing of the Treaty of Dunkirk. Eventually, this pact expanded, initially to include the Benelux countries, through the Treaty of Brussels. Eventually, by 1949, the pact expanded to include the US, Canada, Portugal, Italy, Norway, Denmark and Iceland. This was through the North Atlantic Treaty. This is when NATO was officially founded. The point of this pact originally was to try and balance against Germany and the USSR. While the West tolerated the USSR during the Second World War, it was accepted that this was simply to try and defeat the bigger evil that was the Nazi war machine. There was always going to be an arms race between the East and the West post-war. The West weren't actually in a very good position following victory in 1945. They were economically and militarily weak. The Soviet Union had a much larger military and had dominated their surrounding states. There was obvious anxiety about the Soviets' position in Europe and a clear desire to try and defend against them. Following the collapse of the USSR, theoretically, NATO wasn't really balancing against anything. Despite this, NATO continued to exist. Some would argue that those who are left of centre would back such an institution anyway.
What did that say? Wouldn't the left be happy? No, we're aware that there is a debate on what counts as left. When we say left, we mean left of center and left relative to the right. Okay, so that means we're including liberals, basically.
Irrespective of this technicality, those who are left of centre, it could be argued, may be in favour.
Left of center, usually pro-international alliances. Right of center, usually against international alliances. Yeah, typically like isolationism, things, individualism, whatever, is typically a more right-wing, way of thinking. And, alliances, cooperation, collectivism, that tends to be a more, left-wing thing. So again, that's kind of what I mean. Like, on paper, more international cooperation sounds like a positive. So let's see why that isn't apparently the case.
Favour of more of these alliances, whereas those on the right of centre would argue for a more unilateral foreign policy. There are some examples in the last few years of this being true. Donald Trump often tried to withdraw from international alliances. During his term as president, he withdrew from the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, UNESCO, and UNHRC. When Biden came to power, one of the first things he did was rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. However, the link between the traditional left-right dichotomy and international relations theories is just unfortunately not that clear. While it's true that some on the left may agree with the conception of international organizations, some may subscribe to Marxist international relations theory, which would reject international institutions that serve capitalism. If we go back to the 1975 EEC referendum in the UK, the precursor to the EU, we can see that those on the left of the Labour Party worked with the No campaign. They saw the EEC as a capitalist group and, as such, didn't want the UK to be part of it. The point we're making is that while it may appear that the left is broadly in favour of NATO, it's not quite that universal.
Yeah, like I said, like liberals, in my experience, like hanging out in liberal communities like Reddit, they tend to be very much pro-NATO. But the leftist communities that I hang out in tend to be very much against NATO.
And there are parts of the left that have been, and remain, opposed to NATO. The argument basically goes that NATO isn't protecting anyone. It's doing the opposite. Its continued existence maintains the West versus East paradigm that characterized the Cold War.
Okay, that makes sense. I can empathize with that argument. That actually does make sense.
To NATO's critics, this is not desirable and actually stokes tension, with the world becoming sort of like a big game of Risk, with NATO slowly gaining territory and antagonizing countries like Russia, thus increasing the chances of conflict. Although this debate has recently kicked off in some left-wing subreddits, this isn't actually...
Damn, supporting on r/socialism, supporting neoliberal institutions. Repeat offender, 3 to 7 day ban. Serial offender, permanent ban. NATO support, immediate permanent ban. Damn. Do not apologize for, attempt to justify, or make excuses for neoliberal institutions such as the EU, UN, NATO, WTO, etc. This includes capitalist agreements surged out of neoliberal institutions like these ones. Damn. So, what would, from a socialist, leftist, whatever perspective, what would international cooperation look like? When they say neoliberal here, I assume they're talking about, as he insinuated earlier, anything that uses capitalism in any capacity. And the EU, the UN, NATO, yeah, you could pretty easily argue that capitalism is an inherent, piece of those organizations, an inherent factor within those organizations. So I guess, yeah, to try and answer my question, it would be, I don't know, is trade capitalist? Any sort of trade? There's market socialism, which involves, socialist concepts with some sort of market system. So again, what would non-neoliberal, global or even regional cooperation look like to the moderators of r/socialism? Don't ban me, r/socialism. I'm not saying I support NATO. I'm saying I support international cooperation, fundamentally. Does that mean every single international cooperative is going to do good things? Obviously not. Possibly, probably is the case with NATO, the UN, etc.
Actually, a new opinion. Back in 1998, there was a vote in the US Senate on whether to accept new members into NATO. 10 Democratic senators and 9 Republican senators voted against this. Paul Wellstone of Minnesota argued that there is peace between states in Europe, between nations in Europe, for the first time in centuries. We do not have a divided Europe. And I worry about a NATO expansion which could redivide Europe and, again, poison relations with Russia. Going further with this argument, Stephen Wareheim of the New York Times argued that, in the late 1990s, to the US, the expansion of NATO seemed cost-free. There was no real cost to admitting more countries, and in doing so, they expanded the borders of the West even further. While senators such as Wellstone were opposed, their threats of war in Europe didn't seem tangible and immediate. Some proponents of this argument may even partially blame NATO for the current war in Ukraine, arguing that NATO's expansion pushed Russia into a corner and caused a response. Wareheim even goes as far as saying,
I don't know if I love that argument specifically. They're forced to go commit horrific war crime. I don't know. I don't super buy that. Let me know if you want to give me more details in the comments, if you are someone who, ascribes to that belief, but I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me.
Saying that NATO gives the US legitimacy to fight wars while claiming that they have international support.
That's probably true, and I can see that being an issue with NATO and organizations like it.
An example he gives is the fighting in the Middle East, such as in Libya in 2011. While this was a NATO operation, it was a disaster. But the president could convince the American people that there was wide support for the operation because the US-dominated NATO backed it. This itself builds into another major argument against NATO by some on the left. They claim the organisation promotes American capitalism in other countries. Simply, if you're a socialist or a communist, you obviously don't support this aim. Anyway, these are the arguments against NATO.
Yeah, I would say I don't support spreading American capitalism.
So from a leftist perspective. This isn't to say, though, that these arguments hold or are right. In an interview with International Viewpoint, Teros Bilaus argues that one of the main things that the left don't take into account is that people in Ukraine and other countries between the West and Russia have their own political subjectivity and ability to decide their own fate. In essence, NATO isn't imposed on anyone. countries choose to join it. Belarus goes on to criticise the argument that NATO's expansion in the 90s
Do not love that argument. That does not feel like a well-rounded, well-thought-out argument.
was a US project. While some may criticise the US for allowing countries to join NATO and the effect it may have on the relationship with Russia, the left have forgotten that these countries applied to join NATO. Eastern European countries who joined NATO did so because there was support from their populations, specifically because it guarantees them security from Russia, who may impose a way of life on them that they don't want. Belarus argues that the leftist...
As someone, whose family is from a nation that Russia imposes on, that I think is currently trying to join NATO, I could see that, being a motivator for the citizens to want to join NATO. Russia did terrible things to my home country, my family's home country. It's the reason why I'm living in the US. And so, yeah, I could see that being a motivating factor. Fine, NATO bad, US bad, whatever. Russia bad too, right? We can say that. They do a lot of horrible stuff and have done a lot of horrible stuff to a lot of people. Not to say the US doesn't or NATO doesn't. They can both be bad, right?
Criticism is largely rooted in the fact that a lot of the wars and military interventions may be fought seemingly just to benefit the West. About this...
Well, yeah. Yeah, are you saying that... Brother, are you trying to argue that that's not the case? Because, yeah, that's... Whatever.
He says, that is understandable. You have mainly protested against wars that were in the interests of the West. We have been living with a war in the east of the country for 8 years. So we have had some time to rethink our position. But I think leftists need to understand better that situations can change very quickly. If leftists continue to blame NATO for the Russian invasion, then they show that they have not understood the changed situation. Ultimately, it seems, whether you agree with Belarus or Wehrheim...
Yeah, I don't really think NATO is why Russia expanded into Ukraine. If leftist, is that the argument you're making? It doesn't make sense to me. No one really in this video presented much argument for that point, but that's not one that makes sense to me.
Depends on your fundamental view of NATO. If you think it's American-led and mainly benefits the West while risking the peace, then you're more likely to side with Wehrheim and the left. If you truly think it's a security pact designed to help countries like Ukraine against warmongering neighbours, then you're more likely to agree with Belarus.
No, I don't really agree with Belarus. I do agree with the other guy more, for sure.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform.
Okay. I feel like I got some answers, some still left with some questions, but I'm probably going to leave it here. Please, leftists, let me know in the comments what you think of NATO. What did I get wrong? It's okay if you unsubscribe. I guess you could ask me what my opinion is now. Based on what I've heard, yeah, it sounds like NATO is not something that leftists should support. Because yeah, it does seem to be, from a leftist perspective, a tool to, we were talking about earlier, spread imperialism and enforce capitalism. Am I anti-NATO? I guess so, but I do support international cooperation. Again, a question I have is what does international cooperation look like, right now? Pre-socialism, because right now we're living in a pre-socialism, pre-communism world, right? It doesn't exist. Should there be any international cooperation? And if so, what should that look like? Please let me know.